Hello and welcome to The Blueprint. I'm your host, Marley Finnegan. And before we dig in, please click like and subscribe below. No matter where you get your podcast, it helps us to reach more people. Also, consider leaving us a small donation, whether that be $1, $5, via one of the links below. It really helps us in funding the creation of this work. And it means a lot to know that you're out there and that you like us. So let's dig in. Hello and welcome to The Blueprint. Today, I'm so thrilled to be joined by Gaya Herrington. She is an internationally recognized sustainability researcher and well-being economist who gained international acclaim in 2021 when her study, Update to Limits to Growth, went viral. Gaya is also an author, a public speaker, and has an amazing TED Talk in which I highly, highly recommend. So welcome to The Blueprint, Gaya. So grateful to have you.
I'm glad to be here.
Wonderful. And I reached out to Gaya as I've been following her work for some time. And just the presence and kindness and lovely way in which you received my message and agreed to be on here was just so kismet. And here we are just a couple of weeks later. So I wanted to kind of kick off with something that maybe you don't talk about all the time, but the idea of your childhood and how your upbringing sort of has a through line into what you are experiencing and bringing to the world now.
I've never gotten that question before, and it's so interesting how I that you're asking it because I was recently thinking about that. Only recently, because most of my life I'm just like, I am who I am and I'm living in the now. So, it doesn't really matter. And then I only recently, the sustainability journey really is a journey. All of us go through that. Many of us, some people who are listening to this might recognize how they started out as like, oh, but it's a win-win. And, we can green capitalism. Maybe at some point you believed in green growth. I did at some point. I thought, well, yeah, we could decouple. And then at some point you realize, oh, it will never happen within the current economic system. And then the question becomes, um, so what's next? And then you realize that to change the system, you have to change your inner narrative. And ultimately, what it comes down to is these basic questions of who are we? What does it mean to be human? What are we doing here? And what that comes down to is that we as human beings have to become indigenous again. And then I realized, oh, but wait, that's so tied to other things and ultimately also my childhood because I grew up in the Netherlands and my mother was born in Jakarta, Indonesia, and she was the daughter of basically a Dutch colonist there and a woman he had met there of Indonesia. And so that Indonesia has a very rich culture of mysticism with the beautiful nature there and all the different kind of cultural influences. And I think my mother still, so I grew up in the Netherlands, but I think my mom still gave me that. And then, of course, my father was this right white, tall Dutch guy, like the classic Dutch guy. And the Netherlands is the birthplace of capitalism. So we invented it. And I will grant the Americans that they really turbocharged it, but the Dutch invented it. So that's I've always been in between. I've literally grown up in between those two worlds. And I only recently realized, oh, that's interesting given where I am now. So thank you for that question.
Oh my gosh. And I love that, the way you say sort of reorient ourselves with indigenous wisdom, indigenous worldviews. I feel like when I first understood that we have this dominant worldview and then there's original people's worldviews, which I feel is so deeply embedded in our bones and in our blood and like in every single one of us, no matter what our current physical makeup, you know, looks like. But I want to talk about your study basically is connected to this 1972 best-selling book, which essentially forecasted a collapse that would take place just right about now in this moment that we're in if humanity doesn't change from quote unquote what is referred to as business as usual economics and this business as usual system. Can you briefly describe and define what business as usual means to you? And, also what the most optimal choices we can start to make, especially for individuals that feel so sort of that the system is so huge that they don't have any way to affect it.
I mean, yeah, and that's a very good point also because working in systems is very different from being able to control anything. You have no control. Control is always an illusion, ultimately. You have influence in that system, but it's a very different way of changing the system than just pressing a button and going, okay, we're going to do this. So it can be very overwhelming. But yeah, so let's go back to the MIT study. So that was in 1972. It was commissioned by the Club of Rome, and it was just the Club of Rome, which is a group of thinkers from around the world. They still exist today, and they came together and they were like, why do we have all these persistent problems like poverty, pollution? We're so innovative. We have made so much technological progress. Why haven't we fixed these worst problems that we see? And they also said they intuited, oh, maybe they're interrelated, but how? And so they asked that to a group of MIT scientists who had just worked on this new way of modeling, which is called system dynamics, where variables can all interact. So they built that first world model with that particular technique at the time, called World 3. And so you had all global variables of population, birth rate, food production, industrial output, the pollution that comes with that. And so they ran that and with different scenarios. And one of those scenarios was business as usual, where it was just no additional assumptions. So historical averages only. And that one ended in collapse. And what was in there was, again, historical behavior, which was growth pursuit. So the industrial output growth every quarter, every year, that's what we do. That's what we go for. And so they said that is actually the root of our cause. So what we see as the solution to the problem, like we have poverty, oh, we need more growth, and then we can lift people out of it. We need more growth for innovation, so we can cure diseases. And they said what's actually those things, innovation is not necessarily a product of growth, is mostly of collaboration. And to some extent, materials will help, but when you push that to a limit where social cohesion, for example, starts to break down, or where pollution comes so much that we only get sicker and not healthier, then it becomes counterproductive. So it wasn't an anti-growth message, but they did say this pursuit, the pursuit of growth at all other cost if necessary, that's the root cause of our problems. And so that's since then, that's what I've been bringing, that I say we're not anti-growth, but this economic system where growth is the ultimate goal is inherently degenerative, and we need to move away from that.
Absolutely. And I love the idea of innovation as collaboration versus this sort of idea of complete innovation in silos. And, the idea of the poly crisis is nothing new, but the term polymath has come to me more recently of this multi-solving type scenario. But over time, what I'm seeing more and more of is more hyper-localization of efforts to focus on bioregional, environmental ecosystems and bioregional regional food sovereignty, which are all things that you of course talk about. And the blueprint itself forays into mysticism in a lot of different spaces, but also deeply focused on systems change and regenerative ways of being. Can you talk about sort of this idea of global inequity and how places like America, where we're both located, have these, outsized environmental footprints and impacts per person, and how we kind of can take a stance not against, but take a stance in our own lives to, make better choices and have more awareness about our consumption, generally
Yeah,
speaking, based on the work you
yeah,
do.
yeah. Um, so I want to come back to the competition versus collaboration, but I'll do that at the end.
Mhm.
Um, and so I started when I was earlier in my sustainability journey. I actually had a nonprofit in the Netherlands that focused on, oh yeah, make the green choice. And so that's I just because of that, I want to point out that we cannot consume our way out of this polling crisis. I know you're not suggesting that, but I want to make that very clear because I think one of the distraction tactics that we see from the current power systems that are defending themselves is this focus on individualism that you mentioned. So your personal choices are enough to save the planet, and it's not. So the number one thing you can do as an individual, um, not to say that you shouldn't bring your recyclable water bottle, and you should recycle, but it will also absolutely not be enough. And so the best thing you can do is ultimately, if you're talking about systems change by yourself, you can do nothing. You have to work with other people. You have to connect with other like-minded individuals. And I will say though, even then, there is a personal place to start. So not an individualistic one, but I would say where you start is really with yourself, because if you want to change the system, you first have to deconstruct that narrative that you've been told, that you've literally grown up with. So it's in there. We all have it, and it's a personal journey, and it's a lifelong journey to deconstruct that. But you do have to start there, because otherwise, with the best intentions, you will go out in the system and you will just maintain it. You will just help people greenwash better, basically. So that's really, and that goes also back to your story of, competition that's the current story. That's where innovation comes from. We're trying to beat one another. But if you look at the best innovations, that's really just groups of people, small groups of people too, that are just like, hey, that's funny. They're just playful. They're curious, or they're driven by something bigger than themselves. Let's save humanity from COVID. Who invented that thing? We don't know their name because it was a group of people and no one cared really about getting the credit. They just wanted to find the vaccine. So,
Mm.
and I think the collaboration is much more the root of life. Lynn Margolis is someone who really found that, yeah, within confined spaces, of course, there's competition. That's also a motivating factor, of course. But ultimately, you and I are just elaborate collaborations of organelles that we're like, oh, if we work together, have a better chance of survival. So ultimately, the root of the basis of life really is collaboration rather than competition. So it's really about deconstructing all those narratives within yourself one by one.
Totally. And I think that is exactly, I mean, I wrote a post today about how, and it's funny how unconditional self-love could be such a root of how we kind of dismantle so many external narratives of separation. Because, you know, as indigenous worldviews, and even just recognizing that we have this dominant paradigm and dominant worldview, which intends hierarchy and separation from each other and separation from the parts of ourselves. But how do we, I guess, raise awareness better about that concept, and how do you see that concept of sort of the inner world linked to this external narrative of separation that is so pervasive within capitalism? Or I guess, how important do you think it is, um, the inner work and the psychological aspects of really understanding the self and how we relate to the world and what we see, um, you know, out out there versus internally? And I guess I'm not posing this question well, but what I'm trying to get to is, how intrinsic is the sort of um relationship and sort of reckoning to our inner relationship relative to what you see, in your work over time?
Uh, yeah, that's I think that's highly relative, highly relevant, because I really think it's as I mentioned earlier, it really is that inner change before you can make that outer change. So, for example, it's another one. This never feeling good enough is inherent in the system, and that's it's just practical, right? So nobody had an idea like let's design marketing to never make them feel good enough about themselves. But that's just how in a system where you have constant growth, where how these things just develop. Because of course it does, because at some point our needs are fulfilled, right? That's how marketing started. We're just like, hey, we have soap. Soap is really is a real need, fulfills a real need. But then after that, at some point you have enough soap. So now we have to go into your wants because needs are universal and they can be satisfied, which is great if you want this economy of enough, because if they're universal, you can make policy for it. And if they can be satisfied, you don't need endless amount of resources. So this is great. But if the pursuit is growth, that's very bad news. Because so now we have to invent your needs. So what we basically do is we keep you unsatisfied. We have this economic system that happens to satisfy our social needs very poorly. If you don't have enough money, it also doesn't satisfy your material needs, but that it can do, if as long as you have enough money. So not everybody, but the more privileged ones. But even the more privileged ones in this system, even the winners, are often quite lonely and they feel disconnected from a sense of community and a sense of purpose because the economy doesn't really provide for that. And it has no incentive because how do we keep you from buying stuff? It's like, well, we tie it to some unmet social need. So soap hygiene is we have a very innate thing of cleanliness, right? And so we just make you feel like you aren't clean if you also don't smell like a flower all the time. And so we put all this perfume in there and it disrupts your endocrines and it's not actually healthy. But that's how this cycle just keeps going for everybody. And it depends on us never feeling good enough. So to your point earlier, it really is a radical and anti-capitalist stance to just love yourself as you are.
I love that. And I think your point about sort of where we are within our economy, we have two things as the main compass, and it's GDP and growth, which is basically the same
Oh
concept,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So these over everything have resulted in where we are with such huge inequities in these at a global scale. But I think that what a lot of people don't understand is that we have had so much sort of propaganda and, almost nationalism around the idea of capitalism, particularly in America, that people don't understand or see that growth only based economies are also really socially harmful often, that they can be drivers of inequality, proponents of social and racial unrest, and really erode democracy as what, we can infer is happening in this very moment.
Mm.
So how, I guess, at a global scale, how do you see the psychological relationship to this late stage capitalism? Do you see sort of hope in the underpinnings of movements like post growth and degrowth and these other types of sort of post capitalist movements? Yeah, what are you seeing out there?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for bringing that up because I realized I didn't really address the rest of your question there with the inequalities, but I think that's an excellent point. We all know that the pursuit of growth and our current economic system is bad environmentally. Most people get that, but they feel like, well, but it's at least it's social progress, right? So they feel there's a trade-off between environment and social benefits, which is not true. And that's only because growth is the invisible non-negotiable. But if you take that away, then it goes back to their old dynamic, what I would call old dynamic, which again is what indigenous people always knew. Like we love nature, we are nature, right? There can be a trade-off. We are nature, and most of us, I think everybody probably on this podcast listening, when we hear about the rainforest being on fire, it hurts. It hurts within us. Because we're part of it. And how do you explain that otherwise? So that's this that there's a trade-off like between the environment and our benefits is just it's not true. And that's part of this old thing, of course, with the story of separation. Like what happens there doesn't concern us. which is again, that's not how most of us feel it. There are people who feel it that way. Sociopaths, they genuinely don't feel anything about, externalities about other people, but most of us aren't wired like that at all. So this story, also the Homo economicus fits in there, right? We're just selfish maximizers. It doesn't describe us very well. It might describe us a little bit when we're under duress. So when our basic needs, when we're hungry, when we're thirsty, when we don't have a place to live, then we get really in that short-term selfish mindset, and we can become violent. But once our needs are met, we actually are much more altruistic and playful and curious than that Homo economicus could ever be. And again, that's not really that's not really nurtured in our current economic system. So it's another way of how this is socially so degenerative, individually even. So a lot of us feel that, again, even the supposed winners in this economic system, the rich in the US, a lot of them feel like when they go to work, their jobs are just tricks for money. And we have a strong need. It's a need to feel like what we do has a sense of purpose. It leaves the world a little bit better than we found it. And most of us are deprived of that feeling as well. So that's on an individualistic basis. And then, of course, you're completely right. It is very clear from social science now, some recent Nobel Prize winners as well, that it's very bad for the society as a whole. It erodes social cohesion. It undermines democracy. So again, growth in and of itself is not bad, but in certain situations, it can support human and ecological well-being, and then it's fine. But even then, the growth should be, it's about how that is then distributed. So if you have growth and you put it back into real societal purposes like infrastructure and stuff, then it can still be good. But that's also not what has happened because of this relentless growth pursuit. So if you want to keep going, keep getting growth for the sake of growth, at some point, what are you going to do? You're going to cannibalize on your infrastructure, right? That's what we see in the US. It's crumbling. You're going to cannibalize on the unpaid labor of a lot of people, mostly women. All of that has its limits, and it's all coming to a breaking point right now.
Totally. And I love in Jason Hickel's book how he talks about how happiness is most directly linked with a perception of equity in a country. And that, showcasing in the United States since the 1950s, we've been steadily in a decline of perceived happiness in tandem with our wealth inequity. And, for me, this idea that has been coming up recently is this sort of three-pronged approach to inner peace. And one of those being sort of an empathetic introspection of self, community building, as well as nature connection, which, are really sort of generalizing a lot of ideas into three buckets. But this idea of that being so socially and emotionally fulfilling. And I think about my old apartment, I would see 275,000 cars every single day going downtown in Chicago and coming back and being, seeing the soot from the exhaust wind up on my, patio furniture and knowing this is like the air that my child and I are breathing. And just wondering like how many of these cars are going to places that actually fill their soul and fill their cup, like is regenerative for the earth or regenerative for their actual well-being and how they feel versus, people that are doing it because they feel they need to, because they need to make money within this system in which, they need to feed their family. And there's so many things around, that deep desire. But just to your point about a lot of people feeling isolated and lonely and not feeling like maybe they have community or they are filled up maybe even by the work that they do. So to that end, as a well-being economist, from your perspective, what is sort of the foundation of well-being economy, knowing that it's not just growth or GDP. It's something much more exciting, I hope.
Yes, yes, of course, yes. And GDP is just is just a metric we use for growth, right? So that's what that is. Some people say, well, we should change the metric, and we should. So the one that you mentioned, I think you might have alluded to the genuine progress indicator. So that shows that's also based on some economic indicators, by the way, just like GDP, but it also includes, okay, so for example, if you sacrifice a lot of natural capital for that GDP, that goes away from it because now you have less nature, and we love that. If that takes away from social cohesion, well, that also takes away from your, that's also not progress. So that is subtracted. And when you do that, you indeed see that we peaked around the 70s. And then after that, it's been slowly declining because of all the, the pollution, lack of social cohesion starting to outweigh things. So I think it's important to mention that we should replace GDP, but also still that's not enough because nothing grows forever. Even happiness or knowledge doesn't go on forever. And you would, just like what we see now in late stage capitalism, at some stage you would see very odd things happening. Because I do think, don't you have that? Like um right now it's pretty odd to, it's just odd to witness. I mean I feel like for the past year especially, you mentioned my book. When my book came out less than 5 years ago, it was still called Avoiding 5 Insights for Avoiding Collapse. And it's been less than 5 years, and I don't think we can avoid it anymore. So really, my message is more about how can we make it a just collapse, and how do we? And collapse is not the end of civilization. So it's mostly an end to business as usual. We'll still have business afterwards. It's just not business as usual. We definitely still will have a society, but we will have to rebuild it and redesign it. And so my message is, in that sense, largely unchanged, but it has gotten weirder. And I think what we see sometimes, I don't know, it's not just that it's hard to watch the suffering and destruction, but it's also so absurd. It's so cringe. Don't you have that? It's like, okay, so another species just went extinct and a Kardashian brought out a lollipop for your vagina. Like what? Right? The mental
Totally.
whiplash is yeah, pretty intense. Um so thank you for indulging me. I will now answer your question, which is so what I came out with was, okay, so growth is not a good goal. So we have to replace it with what then? Again, we're not anti-growth. We can still have growth, but it should be in service of something else. And that should obviously be human and ecological well-being. And how do we know that? Well, for one of many reasons, we're already pretending that's what it is, right? Because there's no company in the world that says, well, we on our mission is to just have quarterly profits, all the time as high as possible. That is their real mission. But nobody says it. We're already pretending we have this well-being economy. So because we feel it should be. We feel that that is what it ought to be. It can't be just a way to funnel things from poor people upwards to people who are already billionaires to the new kings. It should be something different. And so that's what we're told. It's not what it is currently. When Donella Meadows wrote a book about thinking in systems, which is very useful. It's wonderfully well written. And she also says, if you want to know what the goal of a system is, don't listen to what they say it is. Just look at the behavior of the system. So the current system's goal is clearly growth. And we should really, for realsies this time, replace that goal and just make the growth subordinate to human and ecological well-being. And in that sense, my message hasn't changed. I don't think we can avoid collapse anymore, but once the current power structures crumble, we have to make sure that we break together and make it as just as possible, and then rebuild in a better way, which is, of course, including an economy that centers around those. So meeting human needs within planetary boundaries.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, amazing. And I think because there's so many incredible concepts that you're bringing up, um, the planetary boundaries sort of sound like, and you said I know the acronym is and I'm gonna totally botch it. What's the better acronym for the well-being economy framework for GDP?
Um, you meant the GPI? The
GPI.
genuine progress indicator? Yeah. Yeah, I should say Herman Daly came up with this already in the 70s. And
Yes.
he was a senior economist at the World Bank. He was very lonely there, from what I understand. But yeah, so that has been around for a little longer than well-being economics came up. Yeah.
Because, to me, I know BP came up with the carbon footprint for individuals in the 90s to assign, the individual responsibility to the environmental,
Hmm.
crisis
Hmm.
that we face.
Yeah.
But it's like I also heard that or read that it was a certain number of top corporations, if they were charged for the resource extraction or the resources that they needed to use for their businesses, none of them would be actually financially viable as organizations. For example, like a Coca-Cola, if they had to pay for the water that they utilize. So what I guess my question is, as an economist, like clearly the writing's been on the wall for a very long time from the smartest people, arguably, in the world. Um, what is it and how is it that it collapses for these corporations that are bulldozing their way through very clear warning signs and, public unrest around these issues in many ways? Of course, there's a ton of money being pulled in or being poured into a reversal of media and ideas that say otherwise. But, you know, I think when I say as individuals about the ways that we consume, financially, where we invest our money is one of the biggest things. Of course, how we eat, how we waste. But to your point, we are not the ones that can really move the needle like these companies can. But how can we kind of bring consciousness to our actions such that it can accelerate maybe the collapse that we need to see in order to rebuild? Or
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
was a lot of questions at once. So
No,
sorry.
yeah, yeah. I mean, this is, and I get that the most, right? What can I do? Because this is pretty overwhelming, Gaia. Like, okay, we only have to change our global economic system, with, the one that we all were born into. Okay, and then you tell me I have no control. Thank you. So here's the thing. They have a lot of power, but we are with way more. So there is
Mhm,
that,
mhm.
and and we don't even need the majority to be with us. So that's also important. We know about climate tipping points, and we know we're like this sit, we're in it. But there are also social tipping points in the system, and those happen typically around 20 to 25%. So you don't need the majority. What you do is you when you build out, when you started to change that narrative, you then that's it has to start there, but it cannot stay there, of course. And so you align with a couple of other people, you connect with them, and you don't need many. Two or three is enough. Four or five, you can move mountains. Okay, so you just move, you connect with a couple of other people that it just makes sense for you to be there in your tribe at your company, or in your tribe in your community. And then you build out new structures in within the system that you're already part of. So for example, in your community, it can be community owned provisioning systems, things around food production, energy production, that sort of thing. So community solar is an excellent example of that. Um, Regenerative agriculture, so growing food based on, you mentioned bioregionalism. That's an excellent example of how again how indigenous people have always produced their food, which is just okay. So we grow it in a way that we don't extract from the soil, so that we have, the soil runs out and we have desertification, but we actually give back, which is totally possible, not within these monocultures, but it's totally possible to do that. but you need you can't just scale that, right? It's not replicable where you just plant it anywhere. You have to know, you have to have intimate knowledge about how this local ecosystem works. And so that's why it's part of bioregionalism. And the answers are not, you can't just replicate them. It's specific to that bioregion. So that's, you see a lot of that happening. And I think the third part there is governance. So all of these things, very much, it's not just like, oh, energy, right? Because if techno-environmental solutions were enough, we would have solved the climate crisis by now. It's very much also about power. So much more than just the electricity. It's the real power. And that is very related to ownership. Who owns the energy assets? Which of course go back to capitalism. Who owns the means of production? We should. These are our commons. This is our land and water, and they've just been privatized. They've been used, and the gains of that have been privatized, and the costs are, of course, socialized. So, I mean, companies are very much for socialism when it comes to the pollution and stuff. They're like, well, this is everyone's burden now. So you know and that's fine. It is, but then also we own the commons together. And again, another Nobel Prize winner, Eleanor Ostrom, looked into that because, of course, we've been told this story that we can't do this because we're selfish people. So we're going to have this tragedy of the commons, right? We're all just going to exploit it. And this is not the case. This typically happens. We have plenty of studies for that. We have plenty of cases. This typically happens when we don't own the stuff. So we're like, okay, well, you know, and then you don't take responsibility. But when we are communally owning these things, we're actually very capable of coming up with good management systems to keep them sustainably for our future prosperity. So that governance part is also very much a part of it. And I would say just see what you can do there in your sphere of influence. Anybody can do. The systems work is very overwhelming. I'll give you that. But also you always have influence. So even if you don't have to be a CEO. If anything, people high up in the system are, it's very scripted. For their roles are very scripted. So don't have any, don't have any illusions about what we can expect from them. And to some extent, they have the least influence. So you always have influence. Find your influence in the system.
I love that. I love that so much. And I am really passionate about food systems innovation and food systems as a keystone aspect of how we build, bioregional resilience and just resilience in general, as it's such a small amount of climate investment has gone into food systems innovation versus things like solar or energy creation, which are just another extension of growthism, and learning that, we've quadrupled, or we've, increased our amount of solar and green energy and renewable energy many, many, many times over, but we just can't catch up ever to the amount of energy needs that we have because of the rapid increase in AI and everything else. Learning about that was shocking, but also at the same time, then I realized how so much investment was going into that from the various government funds, and just the discrepancy made me feel like it's an urgent thing to focus on a localization of food systems and supporting, urban agriculture, regenerative agriculture on as many blocks and as many cities as we can. As far as, if you're speaking to cities and more local governance, you mentioned sort of localizing energy, localizing food. Are there other aspects in which like a local group could focus thoughtfully around how to increase their own, I guess, decrease their dependence on the bigger capitalist system and increase their environmental, consciousness?
Yep. I would say that in general is it. Energy and food are, of course, two major things. Um, but really, what it comes down to, anything that guarantees livelihoods, regardless of growth, that's what you want to do. Which, by the way, again, is totally possible. Totally possible. We have, like you mentioned, degrowth. Degrowth is quite concrete in a whole policy set of, and maybe for listeners, degrowth typically, I describe it as a pathway from our current growthist economy to what I would call a well-being economy. Other people call it a donut economy. It's very similar. So that's the destination where we're like, well, growth is fine if it serves the higher purpose, and if not, we're not going to do it. It's very hard to just get there from this current system. And so degrowth, that's why it's a more, some people find it a more triggering term, degrowth. It's not anti-growth, but that's what they hear. And that just shows how barren this conversation is, right? It's like you say, well, maybe we shouldn't focus completely on growth, and they were like, "Are you anti-growth?" No, I, that's not what that is. This binary shows how we've been taught to like not never touch it, basically.
Right.
And so degrowth has this way of breaking with the current system. How do we do that? And then how do we get to this other economy? So it's more of a pathway. And so what they say is, you have to start by safeguarding livelihoods. Otherwise, we're never going to make that jump, right? We're not going to go hungry to save the planet. We know that. And of course we don't. It's very understandable. So how do you safeguard livelihoods? But nobody wants the destruction of nature, but we just feel like, well, if it's between that and feeding my kids, I'm going to do the latter. So we have to safeguard livelihoods regardless of growth. We have universal basic income is just one of many examples. Working less is another example. I think people don't realize, when I talk to people here in Seattle, for example, they have very high costs. And they're like, I don't even know, I mean, without growth, I mean, I have a lot of costs. I'm like, how many of those costs are because of all the time you spent working, making that salary? There are a lot of defensive costs. We have it at a macro level as well. All the taxes that go into cleanups, etc. Food stamps, right? The healthcare that we subsidize. But on an individual level, there's so many things that we buy just to save us money. So, and we wouldn't mind doing it ourselves if we could just work less. So part of that is also just working less. So you have to consume less to keep up with this whole rat race sort of thing. So there's a whole plethora of policies that will work to get us there. The thing is, we can totally have everybody's needs met without growth. It's not possible to have everybody's needs met by basically not growing the pie, by dividing it more equally. In other words, we're not going to go without growth. And also the billionaires never have to give up anything that they own. That's not possible. And I think that's why we've been told this thing of, well, we have to do growth. We don't really have to, but if you want to keep all your money that you couldn't spend in your lifetime, then it's going to be a different story. So to tie it back to the inequality that you mentioned, this is ultimately inherently about making things more equal for everybody.
Right. It's so staggering when you think about universal basic income and the idea that we could basically, the whole planet could have universal basic income at a certain rate, pick a job that fuels their heart within, a certain bunch of categories. And I think, to me, when I think about Indigenous roles and the healers and the seers and all these, musicians and artists and all these really culturally rich ways of being in which, you were a valuable part of the tribe. And in Ireland, I just saw that they started paying artists living
Yeah.
wage, meaning that they get a salary for creating and for being a creator, which I think often about in the same vein as as an intuitive and really trying to find where I provide value, even though I do many, many, many things, but not a lot of them are aligned with this version of capitalism and with this version of an economy. But just this idea that there is such a cultural richness that can be had when we are able to kind of decouple productivity for the sake of growthism to a different lens, to just like having more time with your family, having more time with your friendships, having more time in general, but also being fulfilled by the work that you do by choice and not by necessity. So I like to talk about the idea of sufficiency, but from your perspective, I know what it means to me. I mean, my biggest expenses are my rent and my food, like period. And I love like investing in local food, and I go to the farmers market and all those things because they're really important to me. But as far as sufficiency in what you perceive where we are, especially I guess in American society with consumption versus like ideal, what are the biggest shifts that need to happen to take us from where we are to where we could be?
Yeah, there are a couple of sufficiency, I think, really it's bigger in Europe and it's coming over this way. I think a couple of things are very unique about the US. First of all, it's young, so it's never known anything else than capitalism. That's not the case in Europe. We invented it, but we had something different before. I'm not saying that was great, but we are totally ultimately our culture is richer in accepting that, well, we can choose a different economic system.
Mhm.
And I think in the US, you've never known anything else. So this idea of like it can't possibly be anything else is, I think, more deeply entrenched. So that's I think that's a challenge. The inequality is also higher. And I think, breaking together, coming together and going, oh, I guess this really didn't work, did it? What do we do now? Is obviously going to be much easier when you have better social cohesion. And otherwise, you're just going to, fight each other for resources. Um, and also, there are a lot more guns in this country. So, and there's a culture of resolving conflict with violence. So, in that sense, I think it's gonna be more. There are a couple of very unique challenges to America, and at the same time, I wonder if this picking yourself up by your bootstraps it was at some point obviously it was weaponized against the poor, but there is a lot of that. And as someone who grew up in Europe, I can tell you this can-do attitude of Americans, I'm deeply impressed with it. I'm like, you got so much hardship. And you're like, okay, so let's pull together and just do it, okay? And like Europeans don't do that. That's we're just like, well, where's the government? And to be fair, our government is little bit better functioning. But if you talk about the community coming together, those kind of solutions, in a way, I can see that be happening more and faster within American culture. And I think that can-do attitude will be a huge advantage to you here as well.
I like to hear that. It sounds as if, unification around the idea of a next stage of our reality would be the best possible scenario. I think for me, the working in sustainability and really talking to people where they very much understand that the way that we're doing things isn't the best way and there's other better ways, but yet not wanting to invest and not wanting to look at it deeply and recognizing how psychologically resistant um, people can be to the idea of climate and the climate crisis and the very real planetary boundaries and the climate disasters we have happening all over the place. How do you see the psychology of this crisis differing, across the globe? Do you see it more being reckoned with more honestly in Europe versus the US? Do you see an avoidance and a resistance in the US, or do you see things starting to come around more psychologically speaking to accepting and grieving what is happening with
I
this?
I do get a sense of that. I for one, the notion that the current system is not working is very, very broadly carried. It's very broadly shared. People may have different opinions about what we need to do different, but the idea that the current system is not working and it's not going to last, people feel it. It's
Mhm.
weighing on people. So there's a lot of not great things about that, but I think that just is what it is. And so that does open up space to have these conversations. So I really feel like these are very special times where we have this breaking of the current system and us working in, the interstices. I hope I say that right. A lot of my English is I learned from reading, so sometimes I'm like, is this how you do it? But this interstitiality, working in the gaps in the system, in the cracks, is something that I think is happening right now, and I do see more people going there. My people keep asking me for speaking events more and more, for example. So later this month, I'm speaking an event with Mike Pence. We're not on the same side, to be clear, but it's there is this, and it's called Apocalypse Now, and it's organized by somebody from who's very active in the Catholic Church. So it's not the usual sustainability people.
Mhm.
So it's very widely and broadly felt that the current system is crumbling, and apocalypse, especially in religious context, is not just it's definitely a crumbling of the existing order, but it's also a revelation of new
Mhm.
knowledge. So and a lot of people are looking for that, and it's not just the sustainability people, it's everybody here. So I do think um in that sense I don't really ascribe to hope anymore. It just is what it is, kind of thing. But I do think if you look at potential, there's a lot of new potential opening up.
Right. I really subscribe to the collapse as, first of all, why are we avoiding it? Why do we fear it so much? Because it's basically so many of us find a deep discomfort, dissatisfaction with what currently exists. And like statistically speaking, I mean, do 5% of the globe benefit deeply from capitalism and 95% don't? I mean, it's a staggering number of how the inequity that is almost unbelievable. And I think in America, we don't realize, if you make $38,000, you are within the top 10% of global earners. I believe that is accurate. And therefore, consumptively, largely more responsible for emissions at a global scale than what we might realize. And that privilege is so omnipresent. But is that an accurate statistic where, I mean, if we're talking about the global earners over a certain threshold, how many people are really deeply benefiting from capitalism at this point? Do
Mm.
you have a sense of
So
that?
I would say, so I don't know those statistics, and the reason is also that I don't, I have some notes on them. Like the income here is very different, even in Michigan, is very different than in the Congo. So ultimately, it's how much does that get you towards meeting your basic needs, and that can be
Right.
very different, right?
Right.
In Tokyo, like 38,000, you're living on the streets. I'm
Right.
exaggerating. I don't actually know. I've never lived there, but it's an expensive city. So ultimately, it's about how much can it satisfy your needs. So the financial statistics can sometimes be, they can not don't reveal all those nuances. Um, so that's why I'm not sure about that. But I would like to say, honestly, that it benefits no one. Because
Mhm.
if you look at other things that matter, so in income wise, yes, so some people are very rich by it, good for them. And even studies suggest in unequal societies, even the top 1% is less happy than the top 1% in more equal societies because
Mhm.
you're constantly anxious, but you have this much, you can only lose it, right? And everybody wants it, and you feel like everybody wants to take it away from you. So you're very busy with defense. Defense. So you also become lonely because of that. The only people you can really relate to are these other very rich people. That's why, it's an inside joke that the very rich only talk to each other by first name because they don't need the last names because it's such a small community. But if you look at that, it's if you look at, for example, so don't want to romanticize Northern Europe, by the way. That happens a lot, and we are very much also using way more than our fair share of Earth's carrying capacity. But if you look, they are more equal, and there's the less income and wealth inequality. And if you look at the Netherlands, for example, our prime minister, he just bikes to work. He bikes to work. There's no security. You just, you know, and I think that seems like a nicer way to go around than when you constantly have these security guards around you. You know what I mean? So I was in Denmark and I spoke at their Volkemode, which is their democracy festival. So it's just on an island, like a Danish island in the summer, and everybody's just intense. And then the politicians speak there, and there's this interaction. And I was there, and the first 10 minutes I was kind of crying, and then the Danish guide I had was looking at me funny, and I was like, yeah, just let me, because I was like, oh, this is what I could just see, the social cohesion. I was like, this is what, like, a healthy society, nobody's afraid that anybody's gonna get shot. I was like, coming from the US, I've lived here for more than 12 years. I was like, oh yeah, I'd forgotten this. And the bombing of it was really felt like a warm bath kind of thing. And so for rich people there, you can just connect with other people. It doesn't your wealth doesn't stand in the way. There's still very rich Danish and there's some poorer ones, but it's you can still connect with other human beings. And I think um, in that sense, capitalism distorts that, and in that sense, it doesn't really benefit anybody.
Wow. That reminds me of, the stories about building bunkers, like environmental doomsday bunkers, and, having the wealth to do that, but also just the fear that is so entrenched in that. And
Exactly.
yeah, of course, living in fear and believing that people would be out to get you or harm you and that others are dangerous is such a harsh and brutal way to live, and disconnected, societally and culturally and everything else. So I
I
definitely,
get the impression that the ultra rich, they always have a foot out the door. I used to live in Hollywood and I was very privileged. I had by far the least impressive house. I had just a little house, but it was overlooking the Hollywood sign, so it was really nice time. And I lived close by to Lady Gaga, who of course I never saw. And she had like the security cameras and the gate and everything. Like I was just street parking, to be clear. But there were some really good, like nice houses right next to me. And I remember when we had this was during COVID, and we had the George Floyd protests, and so we had that massively in LA, and there were riots as well. And I was just watching it on television, and then I noticed that all the lights were off in the entire street. And then a few days later, they were over, and I saw everybody coming back. They had fled. All the street was empty. They had already fled, just in case, because they're always ready. Like, if like the collapse is coming, they're gonna be out of there.
wow, wow, such a wild, wild way to live. And right, I mean, I guess if there were a solution in which you had some amount less, but you had a lot more peace, wouldn't that be worth, being able to share with your neighbors? And I think it is a little bit of that like American bootstrap, like I work so hard for what I have, that almost really works against the financial equitable nature of
Yeah,
sharing.
okay. Cleaners don't work hard. Give me a break. No, I'm sure you worked hard, but we all work hard.
Right. Well, and that's the thing, like you're saying too, about the emotional and the unseen labor of, any number of things, but also, yes, teachers, cleaners, take any, I mean, any job. I think for me, the biggest problem always has been hierarchy, and hierarchy, even as a concept, is so entrenched in this world, and it's so not entrenched in indigenous worldviews. It's really about how all the pieces fit together to bring cultural and, um, harmonious equity across a group in ways that allow time to connect with nature and connect also within.
Yeah,
Um,
indigenous communities still have hierarchy, but so that's one of the ways that you can really start to deconstruct your inner narrative. That's what I do at least. I look at things, I'm like, would it still be there? And then if yes, how would it be different? And most of the times, actually, what at least when I started to look at things, I'm like, it would still be there. It just would be very different. So hierarchies, for example, right now they're often used to control, to impose your will on somebody else. And in for throughout history, we've also had hierarchies that were just more facilitating. So, for example, you can have a chief, but everybody, that chief is only there as long as everybody wants him or her to be. And then, and if they don't want her anymore, then we're going to go for a different one. So it's you could, for example, still have a representative democracy. I think that would make a lot of sense, but it wouldn't be captured by special interest as it is now, right? So I think
right.
hierarchy in it of itself is not is okay, but not this to these levels, right? These levels and levels and levels and levels of hierarchy, and the violence that it inflicts on people, that obviously would not be acceptable.
Yeah, and I guess maybe it's like the intention of the person,
Mm.
um, and how they relate to it. Because, the chief that you're mentioning to me, it feels like someone that would be sort of in integrity with the group's needs versus a hierarchical mindset. And you're right. I definitely could do some work around hierarchy personally. There's no question. I've been banging on about hierarchy for probably way too long. But I'm just grateful for this conversation, and I know we've had so many good points. I would love to kind of close with what you envision for the highest good, for the collective, and if there's any pathways that you see to how we get there.
Yeah, the pathways I see are as I said, I do think we're going to see the breaking of current systems, which is um, ultimately it's a breaking of the power structures, which nobody likes. So I don't want to minimize the suffering and destruction, but it is something at that point where I think more people realize, oh, this was never going to work, and that's really where we can talk about these new structures. This has happened before. Neoliberalism also did that. Nobody was interested in them because they're like, that sounds like nonsense, which it is. This whole trickle down thing. But they waited until a massive crisis, and they'd been building for a long time, and then they inserted that new narrative. And I think we can do that as well with this. The reason I think that could actually work is because it's how humans have organized most of our lives. This growth imperative really only took hold of us. It was created again in Europe around the 1800s, but like this to this extent in our economic system, where it's economic law, even though economy is a social science, so there are no laws. Okay, that only took hold of us for a couple of decades. So 1950s is when it was really turbocharged, when we introduced the GDP. Kuznets came up with that, by the way, and he said, this is just don't use this as like to govern, okay?" And then everybody was like, "We're gonna use it for governing, uh, as
Like
metric
it's
for
a
governing."
placeholder. It's a placeholder. Don't
Yes,
use
he was
it.
like,
It's a
"Okay,
bad
this is
idea.
not a good indicator for well-being. I hope we all know that." And then, but anyway, that's a side note. But I really see us being able to replace all these things and build back in a very different structure where we take back our commons and work and recreate communally owned provisioning systems for one another.
Are there any places in the world that are doing it exceptionally already that you refer to?
There are definitely communities around the world who do this, not at the national level,
Mhm.
but there are pockets of this all around the world where people use these communities, typically villages, all over Latin America, for example, which has a huge, again, has its own cultural heritage that I can't speak too much because I'm not from there, but they have a really strong culture, I would say, of frameworks around human needs and also connection with nature, right? Some of them have enshrined nature laws in their the rights of nature in their laws. One of them had them in their constitution even. So, but they also very research rich. So there's a lot of mining going on, and so there's definitely a lot of you know, you see there that these two worlds fighting as well.
Mhm.
But there's some communities that said we don't want that mining here, and they were able to set up governance systems to provide for the local community in different ways, because that's often how it happens, of course. Going back to like, hey, we will pay you, and then you can feed your children, and if there's no alternative, you're going to do that.
Right.
And so it's really about empowering people also economically in different ways that give back to nature.
So, wow, thank you for that. And I feel like that is very akin to what I'm seeing and hearing is a lot of movements that are starting really locally and bioregionally focused and focused on the local communities, food sovereignty, and just starting small. And
It really is, and it's like it's other people in bioregionalists have called this fractal. So it really is small, and that's what it should be because it's tailored to the local ecosystem, and it fits in the overall pattern of, you know, overall regionalism, real why all across the bioregion these things, and then ultimately moving up to the national level.
Mhm.
And that is happening. And remember, these connections, they're very disjointed at the beginning, but over time they start forming, and that until you get to that critical mass of 20 to 25%. And then the change, the systems change becomes self-reinforcing. So, and only then does the majority come along.
How close do you think we are?
Ah, I
18%.
I don't know. We're clearly not there yet.
Yeah.
And I really don't know. It's actually a good question. Like, could I do maybe my next paper should be on like, you know, are we there to 20% yet?
Are we there
Um,
yet?
yeah. But I can see that accelerating. I
Mhm.
can't see it growing, and in my personal observation, accelerating. So you know, we could be getting there.
You're a huge catalyst of that acceleration, Gaia. I'm so grateful for this conversation and thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us.
It was really was my pleasure. Thank you, Marley.